The night the soul broke. The human mind can endure more than we think: wars, heartbreak, loss, years of silent suffering, but there is a point where the inner scaffolding begins to buckle. Not with noise, but with a quiet shift, a crack you don't hear until it's too late. Carl Gustav Jung knew this territory well. For decades, he had explored the hidden geography of the psyche, mapping its deep caverns and stormlit skies. But there was one case, a single encounter, that even he hesitated to revisit. A patient whose story was so unsettling, so perilous to the boundaries of self, that Jung himself admitted the memory unsettled him for years. It was the winter of 1927 in Zürich. Outside, the streets lay muffled under a fresh snowfall, their lamplight dimmed by the drifting white. The clinic was quiet that evening, the kind of silence that feels like the world is holding its breath. A woman arrived without appointment, her coat dusted with snow, her expression both exhausted and urgent. She did not knock timidly, she entered as if she already belonged in the room. Her eyes were unlike any Jung had ever seen, sharp, but carrying a strange, unbearable weight. "I feel everything," she told him, before even sitting down. "Everything anyone feels. And I can't stop." Jung had met empaths before, people with heightened sensitivity to the emotions of others, but this was different. She wasn't describing intuition or emotional reading, she was describing full possession. When someone near her grieved, she wept uncontrollably. When they felt rage, her heart pounded with fury she could not explain. It was not her imagination, nor was it metaphor. It was as though the emotional boundaries between her and the world had dissolved entirely. And over the next weeks, Jung would come to understand that this gift, this unbearable sensitivity, was not simply a symptom of trauma. It was a doorway into something darker, something vast, and something that, if crossed, might strip a person's selfhood away forever. 1. The empath's gift. In the early 20th century, empathy was not yet the common term it is today. The concept had only recently been introduced into psychology from the German Einfühlung, meaning feeling into. Most people saw it as an artistic or aesthetic faculty, the ability to project oneself into the experience of another. Jung, however, saw it as a potential psychic phenomenon. He understood that human beings unconsciously communicate through an intricate web of emotional signals, subtle gestures, and archetypal imagery. But even within that framework, true pathological empathy, the complete merging of one's feelings with another's, was rare. In fact, Jung could recall only a handful of cases that even approached it, and none with such ferocity as the woman now sitting across from him. She told him her name, though in his later writings, he would disguise it, and she explained her condition with startling precision. Since childhood, she had been able to step inside other people's feelings as though they were her own. At first, it was a strange, beautiful ability. She could comfort grieving friends before they spoke a word, anticipate the needs of strangers, and dissolve arguments with a single empathetic gesture. But as she grew older, her gift became heavier. She began to feel the emotions of entire crowds. On busy streets, she was overwhelmed by sensations: panic from a passerby, jealousy from a shop clerk, sorrow from someone behind her on the tram. It was not a choice. It was an invasion. For Jung, the most unsettling detail was not her sensitivity, but her inability to filter or return what she absorbed. Most people, even highly sensitive ones, have an unconscious barrier between their inner self and the emotions of others. She did not. Jung compared it to a sponge left in the ocean. It did not merely touch the water, it became saturated until there was no distinction between the sponge and the sea. And as her mind became saturated with the world's emotions, she began to lose her own center. The danger, Jung realized, was that the human psyche, robbed of its boundaries, will eventually seek extreme measures to defend itself. 2. The first session. The first formal session began 2 days after their initial meeting. Jung prepared himself as he always did, patient file, notebook, quiet office, but something in him felt unsteady, as though the room itself anticipated her arrival. When she walked in, she didn't look at the furniture, the books, or the fire in the grate. She looked directly at him. "You're worried about your daughter," she said softly. Jung froze. He had not spoken of family, not even alluded to it. And yet the statement was accurate. Her manner was not boastful or intrusive, it was matter-of-fact, as if she were commenting on the weather. Jung attempted to steer the conversation toward her childhood, but she interrupted again, this time identifying the mild irritation he felt toward a colleague, something buried so far beneath his professional surface that even he had been ignoring it. It was the first moment Jung felt the faint, unnerving sensation of being read, not by deduction or insight, but by some invisible, involuntary channel. Over the course of the session, she began describing sensations that seemed impossible to access without direct experience, the tension in his shoulder muscles from long hours of writing, the faint headache he'd woken with that morning, even the subtle tinge of melancholy from a dream he hadn't recorded. He realized, with a kind of cold clarity, that in her presence there was no true privacy. Every emotional contour he carried was open to her, unfiltered, untranslated. And in that moment, Jung began to fear that his role in this case might not simply be that of the physician. 3. The descent. In the weeks that followed, her condition worsened. At first, Jung observed what he thought were standard symptoms of emotional overload, fatigue, difficulty concentrating, recurring nightmares. But soon, the experiences took on a different character. She began describing entire emotional episodes that were not her own, yet consumed her completely. One afternoon, she collapsed in Jung's office, overcome by a grief so intense she could barely breathe. Later, they learned that at that exact hour, a friend of hers, miles away, had received news of a sibling's death. Sleep became almost impossible for her. At night, she reported hearing voices not in words, feelings, bursts of panic, waves of joy, stabbing jolts of jealousy, that kept her awake until dawn. By morning, she felt like a fractured mirror, every shard reflecting someone else's life, but none showing her own. Jung's notes from this period grow darker. He speculates that she was beginning to lose the psychic anchor that tethered her identity to her own experiences. Then came the hallucinations. She began to see people she knew in impossible places, a childhood friend on a street in Zürich, a former teacher standing in the corner of her bedroom, only to realize they were not truly there. These apparitions did not speak. They felt. And those feelings, raw, unmediated, and often violent, poured into her until she was shaking. For Jung, this marked a terrifying shift. Her empathy was no longer limited to the living world. It was reaching into the deeper, archetypal strata of the psyche, where the boundaries between self and other dissolve entirely. 4. The archetype emerges. Jung's fascination deepened alongside his fear. In her dream journals, she began recording visions that corresponded eerily with his theories of the collective unconscious. She described a vast ocean of faces, some familiar, others ancient and strange. Many bore the markings of myth, eyes like molten gold, skin patterned with symbols she had never seen but could draw with perfect precision. Jung recognized in these images the emergence of archetypes, universal patterns of the human psyche that surface in dreams, myths, and visions across cultures. One recurring figure in her dreams was a towering shadow-like presence with countless hands. Each hand touched a different person, and through each touch flowed a separate emotion, grief in one, rage in another, tenderness in a third. But the figure itself was faceless. In Jung's interpretation, this was the archetype of the mediator, twisted into something dangerous, a psychic entity that absorbs all emotions but retains none of its own identity. For an empath, such an archetype was both a mirror and a warning. He also noticed a troubling development. In these dreams, she was not merely observing the archetype. She was becoming it. The woman's own figure would fade, replaced by the many-handed shadow. Upon waking, she would feel drained, her voice flat, her sense of self dimmed. Jung began to suspect that she was undergoing a dangerous process he called participation mystique, a total psychic fusion with the collective that erases individuality. In mythology, such fusions were the domain of shamans and mystics, but in the modern mind, they could lead to psychosis. 5. The snap. The breaking point came without warning. It was a market day in Zürich, the streets alive with merchants calling prices, children darting between stalls, the smell of roasted chestnuts in the air. She was walking through the crowd when she felt it, a sudden spike of rage from somewhere nearby. It was so sharp, so consuming, that she didn't pause to question whether it was her own. She turned and saw a man arguing with a vendor, his voice raised but not yet violent. In her mind, the argument was already an assault. She lunged, grabbing the man by the coat and screaming words that weren't hers. Witnesses later said she seemed possessed. Her face contorted, her voice changed pitch. The man stumbled back in shock, denying he'd ever touched her. But in her perception, she had been protecting herself from an attack she felt as real as any blow. Police were called, but Jung intervened, explaining her condition as a psychological disturbance. Privately, however, he recorded that this was the moment her psychic structure had collapsed. She could no longer reliably distinguish between her own emotions and those of others, nor between reality and projection. In that moment, Jung's professional detachment faltered. He realized that this was not merely a case of pathological empathy. It was a living demonstration of what happens when the human mind is flooded beyond capacity by the collective psychic field. The self had drowned. 6. Jung's fear. In his private notes, never intended for publication, Jung wrote that he feared she had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. He likened her state to that of a person standing at the edge of a whirlpool in the unconscious, slowly being pulled under. He also admitted something he rarely confessed: he feared it could happen to anyone. In his work with patients, Jung had seen glimpses of the same dissolving process in moments of grief, love, or deep trauma. But in her case, the process had accelerated to the point of engulfment. He speculated that her extreme sensitivity might have been an inborn trait, one that, in a different cultural context, could have been trained into the role of a healer or mystic. But in the industrial, rationalist Europe of the 1920s, it had nowhere to go but inward, where it became destructive. What unsettled Jung most was the realization that he himself had not been immune. During their sessions, he sometimes felt waves of emotion that were not his own, a subtle blurring of the line between his psyche and hers. In his final sessions with her, he kept a small brass talisman, a gift from a shaman he had met years earlier, on the table between them, as if to anchor himself against the pull. 7. Legacy of the case. After the incident in the market, her condition never fully stabilized. Jung continued to see her for months, but each session felt like speaking through a fog. She would drift into long silences, eyes distant, as if listening to a conversation only she could hear. Eventually, she withdrew from treatment altogether. Jung heard rumors that she had moved to the countryside, living alone and avoiding crowds, but he never confirmed them. He rarely spoke of her afterward, except in veiled references during lectures on the dangers of unconscious identification with the collective. In one lecture, he described a woman who became the sea in which all emotions swam, until the sea forgot it was water. Those who knew his work suspected this was her. The case served as a warning, not only to clinicians, but to anyone tempted to believe that empathy is an unalloyed virtue. Unfiltered, unchecked, it could consume the self entirely. Today, the story stands as both mystery and caution. We celebrate empathy in our culture, but Jung's most terrifying case suggests there is a threshold beyond which compassion turns into collapse, where the gift of feeling becomes the curse of losing oneself. And somewhere in the quiet snow of Zürich, a woman once crossed that threshold and never truly came back.